Hey, this is driver 88. So the other day we drove an Audi R8 and talked about the fact that it had finally finished its production run in 2024. Another car that finished its production not that long before that is the Lamborghini Huracan. This car is now 10 years old, and I've got a 10-year-old example here to review and see whether it's worth taking the risk of buying a 10-year-old Lambo. The Huracan is the quintessential car of the 2010s. It's just a classic shape that was incredibly popular. Over 25,000 units were sold all over the world. We're going to look at the market, the performance, its competitors, insurance, all that good stuff. Is it worth taking the risk to buy a 10-year-old Lambo today? Let's have a look. So the Lamborghini Huracan, 10 years ago plus, it launched and it really took the supercar market by storm. They sold an absolute huge amount of them, and that is the reason why you'll see them in every major city. They're there out to be hired for you for an experience. You see them in all the video games, you see them racing. They're every crypto bro's dream. And not to judge too much, but this is the sort of car that non-car people buy when they make some money. It's kind of the generic supercar which people drive or buy to show that they've made it and they want some attention. That's not to take away from its abilities and its looks, and of course that incredible 600 horsepower V10 behind me, but it is kind of that car that kind of you see so much of and it kind of takes away from its specialness. The good thing about this one is now 10 years old and it doesn't have OPFs, so it's incredibly loud. So let's just listen to it for 1 second. So much better. Somewhere out there, a Range Rover is not happy. Thanks to the Lambo. Now, inside and out, I think the Huracan has aged incredibly well. These looks, if you talk to a person who is not particularly into cars, they'll probably think that this car could be brand new or a few years old, but ultimately the shape has aged so well. From this all the way up to the crazy STO, I think a brilliant looking supercar. On the interior, which we'll look at now, has also aged not that poorly. Now this example is 35,000 Ks or so. It's not perfect. Due to all the heat, of course, we have a little bit of damage on our plastics here. I don't think this is a hard fix at all. The other one that's probably a pretty easy fix and not that expensive is some new kick plates. These don't feel expensive at all. I would just buy some new ones. The leather has held up incredibly well though, and I think that's more important because that's far more expensive to fix. Still looks quite good. Red's not for me, but has aged quite well. So welcome to the cramped interior of the Huracan. So how has a Huracan interior held up over 10 years and 37,000 kilometers? Well, tech-wise, I don't think you really particularly need anything more in a supercar. You've got a very clear and bright screen in front of you. Now, the leather has held up incredibly well. The leather has held up really well. Some of the things that don't feel that great are some of the plastics here. For example, your gear selector, it's just like a little bit creaky. The action is still fine, but just that kind of creak of plastic. Same with, like, for example, your very cool paddle shifters. There's a little bit of play in them. They're not terrible. What I like is that there's not that much gloss black in here, so there's not much to scratch up. But all in all, still a very hot interior, just a tiny pillbox to look out from, much smaller in I guess size and rake compared to the R8 that we drove not that long ago, but still looking very cool for a 10-year-old car. What do you think, guys? Ultimate 2-car garage? I think that's an excellent solution. V10, V8, all the space. Now, a huge part, of course, of the Huracan's appeal is the V10 sound. Now, of course, you could have got this in all-wheel drive or rear-wheel drive. This is the kind of most common all-wheel drive 610, for example, and What it lacked in power compared to its competitors like the 488 and the 650S, it made up for in brutal 0 to 100 times in under 3 seconds if you could hook it up. You could get high 10s to mid 10s depending on the surface, but generally the other twin turbo cars would be pulling away from you. Most Lambo owners I don't think could care that much though, given the sound and looks of this thing. If there's one thing great about the fact that this is a 10-year-old Huracan is that it doesn't come with OPFs, that's the petrol particulate filter, which is ruining all sorts of cars and making them quieter today. So even in your standard sport mode, the car is just incredibly loud. Reversing camera is adequate. You know what else I find good when I was just reversing into traffic?
Yeah.
These little triangular windows here. These are a lifesaver.
Yeah,
they saved me, these triangular windows. Lamborghini, it's because of the Germans, Henry.
If they weren't there, you wouldn't see much, would you?
Now in summer here in Australia, and what I can tell you is that at least the aircon works quite well. I remember back in the day when Clarkson used to say that Lamborghinis had air conditioning that felt like someone was coughing through a straw at you, and that's quite the opposite here, thankfully. On a hot day, the aircon is perfectly adequate. Now, speaking of auto journalists, my favorite one, Chris Harris, when the Huracan first came out 10 plus years ago, he said that Lamborghini has made a car for people who can't drive. And maybe there's a little bit of truth to that, in that this is an incredibly easy car to drive and it does really look after you. And there's an enormous amount of all-wheel drive grip. This car is not just going to snap and let go all of a sudden. The immediacy and the linear way in which it delivers power is intoxicating though. That has not aged a day in that sense. Now, one thing that you may struggle with, like Lamborghinis of old, but even though this is a modern one, I'm only 180 centimeters tall and my head is just about hitting the roof. I'm sort of having to slouch down, which I don't have to do in a 911. I don't have to do in a 488. So that's something that may cause you to just not choose a Huracan because of the seating position and just the lack of ergonomics here. In terms of steering feel, honestly, there's maybe a little bit more in the Performante, probably more in the STO, but this standard 10-year-old 610 all-wheel drive spec, the steering just doesn't provide me with much satisfaction. What will provide you with satisfaction though is the dual clutch gearbox. It's just purely instant. There's no feeling of slack. There's no feeling like this gearbox is slipping at all. Even though it's spent 37,000 kilometers managing this 600 horsepower V10, it is really impressive technology for something that is now quite dated. Could you drive this thing daily? I don't see why not. If you don't have any sort of health ailments, this is 10 times more comfortable to drive this than say a Diablo or a Murcielago. Yes, the cabin is small, but if you're a shorter person, it drives like any other car, other than the fact that it has aggressive acceleration and V10 sound. It feels a lot faster than the Mark II R8 Spider we drove the other week. I love how this car just wants to go. It wants you to drive it quickly. It wants you to drive it fast. You're not going to have that pinpoint accuracy of steering. It's not got that super sharp steering of a Ferrari, but the rest of the attributes of the car are going to be so entertaining for you. You're probably not going to care that much. I just love when you get to about 6,000 RPM plus, the cabin just comes alive. It is intoxicating. All right, now that we've had a bit of a drive, let's look at the used market and the competition that is for sale for other 10-year-old supercars. Now let's look at the used car market for 10-year-old Lamborghini Huracans as a whole. Now before you freak out, just be aware that all these figures will be in Australian dollars, and we pay an incredibly high amount of money for our supercars because our taxes are super high. So the Lamborghini Huracan 2015, that was $470,000 sticker price 10 years ago. There's currently 7 of them for sale, and across those 7, the average asking price is 405,000 Australian dollars. So when you consider, if you owned a Lamborghini Huracan for 10 years, you've done pretty well if you've enjoyed, say, 30,000 kilometers with the car, because it's only depreciated 13.8% on average. Of course, that is before options, so all those cars might have been a little bit more expensive. However, I think that is pretty good. Now, those prices are a little bit higher because we're in a smaller market, and you know, the last 3 to 5 years has had insane inflation and that sort of thing. So you're not really getting that much of a bargain in my market. Maybe you're seeing bargain Huracans come up in your market. Let me know. Now, against the competition, the 488 GTB, there's only 4 of them for sale. That came with a sticker price of $512,000, so it was a fair bit more than the Huracan at the time. The average asking price is $454,000, so a good 10-15% more expensive than the Huracan. And that is also because options for Ferraris are incredibly higher than Huracans. They generally have dealers want you to put as many options as possible on them, and the kilometers for Ferraris are generally lower than Lamborghinis. So that is depreciated just 9.3%. On the complete other end of the spectrum is the McLaren 650S. So I could only find 4 cars for sale. A few years ago, there used to be like a dozen of them for sale. They're quite popular to put on the used market for sort of obvious reasons if you know McLarens. That had a sticker price of $501,000, and the average asking price at the moment is $307K and $500. So an appreciation of 38.6% on the McLaren 650S, just for the coupes. So all of those are coupes to make it a little bit fairer. So yeah, McLarens, they just depreciate a lot harder. They're not as reliable, arguably in most cases more expensive to service than the Huracan. So that is the used market at the moment. Let me know what's happening in your Huracan market for 10-year-old Lambos. So somehow a 10-year-old Lamborghini Huracan seems like the most reasonable choice against its competitors. Personally, I think that the other two are far more exciting to drive in terms of their dynamics, but the Huracan has that incredible V10 sound, the overall more reliable and more available, and is probably the reasonable choice for a 10-year-old supercar today.